"You've got the wrong file," her nurse shouted as papers scattered across the hallway. Lorna sat quietly in the hospital waiting room, clutching her small bag as she fought off waves of dizziness. The air smelled of antiseptic and freshly cleaned floors, and the muffled voices of doctors and patients added to her growing discomfort. Her fever had only worsened overnight, and her aunt had begrudgingly sent her to the clinic, muttering about wasted time and money. Across the hallway, two nurses collided as they rushed in opposite directions, their arms full of medical charts and patient files. The collision sent papers flying like autumn leaves, scattering across the polished floor. "Be careful next time," one of them snapped, hurriedly grabbing the files. "I'm sorry. It's the new system, everything's confusing," the other replied, frantically gathering loose sheets. In their haste, neither noticed that some files were swapped in the chaos. Meanwhile, Lorna's name was called, and she rose, her head spinning slightly. A nurse guided her to an examination room, where a doctor greeted her briskly. "Flu symptoms and fever, right?" the doctor said, barely glancing up from the file in his hands. "Yes," Lorna replied softly, but the doctor didn't seem to hear. "All right, we'll take care of this quickly," he said, scribbling notes. Moments later, another nurse arrived, pushing a wheelchair. Lorna hesitated. "Do I really need a wheelchair? It's just a fever." "It's protocol," the nurse said curtly, avoiding eye contact. Confused but too shy to argue, Lorna complied. The next hour passed in a blur of medical jargon and unfamiliar faces. She tried to ask questions as she was wheeled into a sterile operating room, but the staff seemed too busy to notice her growing panic. "Wait, what's happening?" she managed to stammer, her voice trembling. "Just relax," a voice said soothingly. "It'll be over soon." Before she could protest further, the anesthetic took hold, and the world faded into darkness. When she woke hours later, her body felt strange, heavy and unfamiliar. A nurse helped her sit up, smiling kindly but avoiding her eyes. "All done. You'll need rest," the nurse said before hurrying out, leaving Lorna with more questions than answers. "You've been out too long." "What nonsense are you up to this time?" her aunt barked as Lorna opened the door. Lorna trudged into the small, cramped house she had called home for the last 8 years, her limbs aching from exhaustion. The hospital visit had left her more confused than ever, and the dull pain in her abdomen only added to her discomfort. She had barely stepped inside when Aunt Regina's sharp voice cut through the air like a whip. "Where have you been all day? Skipping school again, I bet." Regina continued, glaring at Lorna from the one couch where she sat folding laundry. Lorna stood silently in the doorway, her bag slipping from her hand. "I wasn't at school. You sent me to the hospital, remember?" Regina snorted. "Hospital, my foot. It doesn't take the whole day to treat a flu. Or are you looking for excuses now? Let me guess, you're just lazy." I wasn't feeling well," Lorna murmured, her voice barely audible. She wanted to explain the strange hospital procedure, to tell her aunt about the wheelchair, the surgery, and the nurse's hurried dismissal. But the words stuck in her throat. Regina rose abruptly, tossing a shirt onto the pile. Her sharp eyes scanned Lorna from head to toe. "Well, if you're back, there's no reason to stand around like a statue. The dishes aren't going to wash themselves. And don't even think about sitting down until you're done." Lorna nodded weakly, her stomach churning. She shuffled toward the sink, where a mountain of dirty dishes awaited her. Her hands trembled as she turned on the faucet, the day's events playing over and over in her mind. As she scrubbed, she thought of her parents. Her mother's warm embrace and her father's kind smile seemed like distant memories now, almost like a dream she could barely recall. The accident that claimed their lives had left her in the care of Aunt Regina, a woman who saw her as little more than an unwanted burden. She finished the dishes just as the pain in her abdomen flared up again. Wincing, she leaned against the counter, taking deep breaths. "Done already?" Regina's voice startled her. "Good. Now take out the trash and mop the floor." Lorna wanted to protest, to tell her aunt about the strange cramps and her overwhelming fatigue. But she knew better. Complaints only invited more scorn. Instead, she nodded and dragged the trash bag toward the door. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress in her tiny room, tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She pressed her hand against her stomach, her thoughts racing. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But who could she tell? Who would even believe her? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door creaked open, and one of her cousins, Millie, peeked in. "You okay?" Millie whispered, her eyes wide with concern. Lorna hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Just tired." Millie frowned but didn't press further. "If you need anything, just tell me, okay?" she said before slipping back into the shadows. Lorna stared at the ceiling, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. What had they done to her at the hospital? And why did it feel like her life was about to change forever? "You look like you've seen a ghost," her best friend, Sarah, whispered during lunch. Lorna sat in the corner of the school cafeteria, poking at her food with a fork. Her appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease that seemed to grow by the day. She had barely slept the previous night, her mind fixated on the oddities surrounding her hospital visit. "Are you okay? You've been acting so weird lately," Sarah pressed, leaning closer. "I'm fine," Lorna replied quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "You don't look fine. Did your aunt say something again?" Sarah's voice was filled with concern. Lorna shook her head. "No, it's not that. It's just, I don't feel like myself. Something's off, and I don't know what it is." Before Sarah could ask more, the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch. Lorna sighed in relief, grateful for the excuse to escape the conversation. As the day went on, the strange sensations in her body became harder to ignore. During gym class, she felt a sudden wave of dizziness that nearly knocked her off her feet. The coach called her over, frowning. "Are you feeling all right, Lorna?" "I think I just need some water," she said, clutching her stomach. He nodded and dismissed her, but as she walked to the locker room, the cramps returned, sharper this time. She leaned against a wall, breathing heavily. Her mind raced back to the hospital. The procedure. The wheelchair. The lingering pain in her abdomen. Something didn't add up. Why had no one explained what was happening to her? After school, she decided to stop by the pharmacy. She didn't have much money, but the thought of living with this uncertainty any longer was unbearable. Inside, she scanned the shelves, her heart pounding. The idea seemed absurd, but a growing fear pushed her forward. She grabbed a pregnancy test and quickly paid for it, avoiding the cashier's curious glance. When she got home, she slipped the test into her pocket, careful not to let Aunt Regina see. She waited until everyone was asleep before locking herself in the bathroom. Her hands trembled as she read the instructions, her breath shallow. Minutes later, the results stared back at her, bold and unmistakable. Positive. Lorna sank to the floor, the test clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as disbelief washed over her. How could this be happening? She hadn't even been in a relationship. The only explanation was the hospital. Her thoughts spiraled as she tried to make sense of the impossible. What had they done to her? And why? The sound of footsteps in the hallway startled her. She quickly hid the test, her heart hammering in her chest. Aunt Regina's sharp voice called out, "Why is the bathroom light still on?" "Coming." Lorna called back, struggling to steady her voice. As she climbed into bed, her mind churned with questions and fears. She needed answers, but who could she trust? "You're pregnant," the doctor announced, his voice calm but firm. Lorna froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. She sat in the small, sterile office, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. The word echoed in her mind, pregnant. "That's impossible," she stammered. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of her confusion and fear. "There must be a mistake. I've never." She trailed off, too embarrassed to continue. The doctor adjusted his glasses, glancing at her file. "I understand your concern, but the test results are conclusive. You're about 2 months along." 2 months. Lorna's mind raced. 2 months ago, she had been in the hospital for what she thought was a flu. The memory of that day flooded back, the wheelchair, the surgical procedure, the nurse's hurried words. Could it be connected? "This doesn't make sense," she said, her voice shaking. "I was here 2 months ago for a fever and flu. They did something, but I didn't understand what it was." The doctor frowned, leaning forward. 2 months ago. What exactly happened during that visit? Lorna recounted the events as best as she could, the nurses colliding in the hallway, the rushed procedure, and the vague reassurances she had received. The more she spoke, the more the doctor's expression darkened. "I'm going to look into this," he said finally. "It's possible there was a mix-up, but we need to confirm the details before jumping to conclusions." Lorna left the office in a daze, clutching a piece of paper with follow-up instructions. Her world felt like it was spinning out of control. How could this be happening to her? At home, she paced her small room, debating whether to tell Aunt Regina. The thought of her aunt's scorn made her stomach churn, but keeping this secret felt unbearable. Finally, she worked up the courage and approached her aunt in the kitchen. Regina was chopping vegetables, her movements brisk and mechanical. "I need to tell you something," Lorna began hesitantly. Regina didn't even glance up. "If it's about needing more money, forget it. I've spent enough on you this month." "It's not that," Lorna said, her voice trembling. I'm pregnant." The knife stopped mid-chop, and Regina turned to face her, her eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" Lorna swallowed hard. "I found out today. It wasn't my fault. It happened at the hospital. Don't you dare blame someone else for your mistakes." Regina snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you think I'm stupid? Pregnant from a hospital? What kind of ridiculous excuse is that?" "It's the truth," Lorna insisted, tears streaming down her face. But Regina was already shaking her head. I knew you'd ruin yourself eventually. Just like your mother, always making poor choices and expecting others to clean up the mess. The words cut deep, and Lorna felt her knees weaken. She fled to her room, slamming the door behind her. Sobs racked her body as she curled up on her mattress, clutching her stomach protectively. She had never felt so alone. The doctor's words replayed in her mind, alongside her aunt's cruel accusations. Somehow, she had to find a way to prove the truth, if only to herself. You're saying this could be my child? Henry's voice was a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. In a lavish office adorned with mahogany furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows, Henry, a prominent businessman, sat across from his wife, Clara. The couple had been waiting anxiously for news from the hospital about their surrogacy procedure, one they had planned meticulously for months. But when the hospital's director called, his voice laced with unease, it became clear something was amiss. What exactly are you trying to say? Clara demanded, her tone sharp and impatient. The director hesitated before continuing. There seems to have been an error during the surrogacy process. The files were mixed up that day, and the procedure was performed on the wrong patient. Clara gasped, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the desk. Wrong patient? How does something like this even happen? We deeply regret this mistake, the director said, his voice heavy with guilt. But we've managed to trace the young woman involved. Her name is Lorna. She's a teenager who came in for a routine checkup that day. Henry leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The idea of their potential child growing inside a stranger's body was unfathomable. Yet, a strange mixture of hope and determination began to stir within him. Where is she now? He asked. She lives in a small town about 2 hours from here, the director replied. We can provide her contact information, but we recommend proceeding with sensitivity. This is a delicate situation. Clara's face darkened, her lips pursing tightly. Delicate is an understatement. This girl is a complete stranger. How can we trust her? Henry placed a reassuring hand on his wife's arm. We don't have a choice, Clara. If she's carrying our child, we need to be involved. Meanwhile, Lorna was grappling with her own turmoil. The days following her revelation to Aunt Regina were unbearable. Her aunt's hostility had only intensified, and the whispers at school made her feel like an outcast. One evening, as Lorna sat alone in the kitchen, a knock at the door startled her. Aunt Regina answered it, her expression turning sour as she saw the impeccably dressed couple standing on the doorstep. Can I help you? Regina asked curtly. Henry stepped forward, his demeanor calm but authoritative. We are looking for Lorna. Regina's eyes narrowed. What business do you have with her? Henry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It's a personal matter. We've come a long way to speak with her. Lorna, overhearing the exchange, peeked out from the hallway. Her heart raced as her eyes met Henry's. Something about his presence was both intimidating and comforting. I'm Lorna, she said softly, stepping forward. Henry smiled warmly, though Clara remained stiff beside him. Lorna, we need to talk. It's about the baby you're carrying. Lorna froze, her mind racing. How did they know? Were they here to accuse her of something? What do you mean? She asked cautiously. Henry's voice was gentle but firm. The child you're carrying, it's ours. The room fell silent. Regina's face contorted in disbelief, while Lorna stood rooted to the spot, her breath catching in her throat. Did you enjoy the tale? If so, welcome and welcome back as we meet in part 2 of the story. Please like and share the video, drop your comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Thanks for watching and see you on the next.